The tow truck's flatbed groaned as the hydraulic lift dragged Daniel Reyes's old Ford pickup off the curb, its wheels spinning uselessly in the air. And from the back seat came the muffled, panicked sound of a 7-year-old boy screaming for his father. Daniel came running out of the coffee shop across the street with 2 cups still steaming in his hands, and by the time he reached the truck, Marcus was already pressed against the window, small fists pounding the glass, his face streaked with tears. Daniel dropped the coffees on the pavement without a second thought and sprinted the last 20 feet, shouting at the driver to stop, to just stop. For 1 second, there was a child in the vehicle. The tow operator, a heavy-set man with a clipboard and no patience for complications, told him it was already company policy that once the hook was set, there was no reversing it without a supervisor's authorization. And the only supervisor who could authorize that stood 30 feet away on the top step of a glass-fronted skyscraper, watching the entire scene unfold through a pair of sunglasses she hadn't bothered to remove. Around them, the plaza kept moving, as if nothing were wrong. Interns hauling equipment cases, a line of reporters checking their phones for the live stream link, all of it oblivious to the fact that a child was locked inside a truck being hoisted off the ground 20 feet from a product launch worth $100 million in projected revenue. Vanessa Cole had ordered the tow herself less than 4 minutes earlier, standing in front of a bank of cameras for the launch of Cole Dynamics' newest software platform. Irritated that some battered pickup truck with a cracked taillight had been parked crookedly across 2 visitor spaces reserved for press. She hadn't looked inside the truck. She hadn't asked anyone to check. She had simply pointed at it from the podium mid-sentence and told her assistant to have it removed before the ribbon-cutting photos were taken. Because nothing said negligence like a construction-grade eyesore parked in front of $100 million reveal. It was a decision she made the way she made most decisions, quickly, cleanly, and without the faintest consideration that there might be a person attached to the inconvenience. She had built an entire career on that kind of speed, the ability to see a problem and eliminate it before anyone else had finished noticing it existed. It was until this exact moment, the thing she was proudest of, the trait that had carried her from a nervous 17-year-old sitting at the edge of a family dinner table where nobody quite believed she belonged, to the head of a boardroom where nobody dared question her instincts. She had never once imagined that instinct could point at the wrong target. The screaming registered a half-second before she understood what she was looking at. And by the time she crossed the plaza in her heels, phone already pressed to her ear to call off the tow. Daniel had wrenched open the truck's back door and pulled his son into his arms, murmuring against the boy's hair that he was fine, that nobody was taking him anywhere, that Daddy had him. Marcus was hiccuping through his tears, his small hands fisted in his father's shirt, and Daniel's own hands were shaking as he held him. A tremor Vanessa noticed only because she had spent a lifetime learning to read the tiny signs people tried to hide from a room. She stopped a few feet away, her heels suddenly feeling absurd on the pavement, and said the first thing that came to her, which was an apology so automatic and so hollow that she heard it land wrong the moment it left her mouth. Daniel didn't even look at her. He kept his eyes on his son, checking his face, his arms, asking him in a low voice if he was hurt anywhere. And when he finally did glance up at her, it wasn't with anger. It was worse than anger. It was the flat, assessing look of a man who had already decided exactly what kind of person she was and didn't feel the need to say it out loud. A small crowd had gathered by then. Phones raised, a junior reporter already murmuring into her own camera about the incident unfolding outside the launch event, and Vanessa felt the particular chill of watching a story take shape in real time, one she had no control over and would spend the rest of the day trying to contain. Her head of security appeared at her elbow, already talking about statements and damage control, and she waved him off without looking away from Daniel and the boy, aware for the first time in longer than she could remember that the smartest move in the room was not the fastest one. She crouched slightly, not touching either of them, and told the boy again that she was sorry that this was her mistake and not his father's. But Daniel cut in before she could say anything more, telling her flatly that they didn't need an audience for this, and that if she wanted to apologize, she could do it somewhere that wasn't currently being filmed by 6 strangers. By the time Vanessa made it back up to her office, her phone was already lit up with 4 missed calls from the chairman of the board. A man who did not personally call anyone unless a building was on fire or a lawsuit was imminent. She answered on the elevator, already composing the press-friendly explanation in her head. A minor operational mishap quickly resolved, no lasting harm. But Richard Ashford didn't let her finish a single sentence. His voice, usually a study in unbothered calm, came through clipped and urgent, asking her if she understood what she had just done, if she had any idea who she'd had towed off Coal Dynamics property in front of 24 reporters and a live stream camera. Vanessa told him it was a man with a truck parked in the wrong spot, and there was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that she checked to see if the call had dropped. Richard's voice, when it came back, had lost all its usual polish. He told her that man was Daniel Reyes, and when she said the name meant nothing to her, he asked her with a kind of disbelief she had never heard from him before, whether she had actually read the full shareholder registry when she took the CEO position 3 years ago, or whether she had simply trusted the summary someone handed her. She told him she'd read what mattered. He told her that apparently she hadn't, because Daniel Reyes held a controlling minority stake in Coal Dynamics, under a trust that had been quietly reactivated 8 months ago. A stake large enough that if he voted it against her at the next shareholder meeting in conjunction with even one other major holder, her position as chief executive would not survive the quarter. He told her to get to Daniel's location immediately, to apologize properly this time, and to do absolutely nothing else until she heard back from the full board, who were, in his words, currently losing their collective minds in a conference room 3 floors below her. Vanessa stood frozen in the elevator as the doors opened onto her floor, the polished glass and steel of her own office suddenly looking like the inside of a trap she had built herself. Through the glass wall of the executive conference room, she could see 3 board members already on their feet, phones pressed to their ears, papers scattered across the table in a way that told her this was no longer a public relations problem, but something closer to a crisis of survival. One of them, Grant Whitfield, the vice chairman, who had never once in 3 years missed a chance to remind her that she hadn't been born into this company, the way the Cole family had, caught her eye through the glass with an expression she couldn't quite place, somewhere between alarm and something colder, something almost satisfied, as though a piece he'd been waiting on had finally moved into position. She didn't have time to examine that look before her assistant intercepted her with a stack of messages and the address of the rental car company where Daniel had been sent to wait out the aftermath of the tow. She had spent 3 years clawing her way into that position. 3 years, proving to a board that had taken her in as a teenager and never quite trusted her instincts, that she could run the company better than anyone born into it. She had done it by being faster than everyone else, more decisive, more willing to make the hard call before anyone else even saw the problem coming. And in 4 seconds, without knowing it, she had pointed at the one man on earth who could take all of it away, and she hadn't even bothered to ask his name first. It was the kind of realization that didn't just frighten her, it embarrassed her, because it exposed the exact habit she had always been proudest of as the very thing that had nearly destroyed her. She found Daniel in the parking structure across the street 20 minutes later, crouched beside Marcus on a concrete bench, a paramedic from a passing ambulance checking the boy over as a precaution, even though he insisted he was fine, just scared. Daniel's jaw was tight, his eyes rimmed red in a way that told her he had been fighting to keep himself steady in front of his son. And when he saw her approaching, something in his posture hardened into a wall she could feel from 10 feet away. She opened her mouth to apologize again, properly this time, the words she had rehearsed in the elevator, but he cut her off before she got past his name. He told her he didn't want her apology, that an apology didn't undo the look on his son's face when he thought strangers were taking his father's truck away with him locked inside it, and that people like her never actually understood what their decisions cost other people because they never had to live with the wreckage. Vanessa, who was not used to being spoken to that way by anyone, least of all a man in a paint-stained work shirt, felt something sharp rise in her chest. Some old defensive reflex she'd carried since childhood. The need to prove she wasn't careless, that she wasn't like the people who'd once looked at her and decided she didn't belong. But she caught it before it left her mouth, because for the first time in longer than she could remember, she actually looked at what she'd done, instead of explaining it away. She crouched down to Marcus's level instead of standing over him, and told him she was sorry his day had been scary, that it wasn't his fault at all, and that she should have looked inside the truck before she made a decision that affected him. It wasn't the polished statement she'd give reporters. It was smaller, quieter, and true, and something in Daniel's expression shifted slightly at hearing it, though he didn't soften completely. He told her in a voice low enough that only she could hear that he hadn't asked for any of this, that he'd spent years trying to keep his name out of anything to do with coal dynamics, and that her little stunt today had just made that a lot harder for both of them. Vanessa asked him what he meant, and he looked at her for a long moment before he said that was a conversation for the board, not for a parking garage, and that she should go find out exactly what she was dealing with before she said another word to him. There was no theatrical edge to the way he said it, no attempt to make her squirm, only the tired certainty of a man who had clearly been dreading this exact conversation for a long time and had hoped it would never come. She watched him gather Marcus into his arms and walk toward a rental car the tow company had arranged as an apology, his shoulders squared in the particular way of a man determined not to let anyone see how rattled he actually was. Vanessa stood there long after he'd driven off, her phone buzzing again with Richard's name on the screen, and for the first time in her career she felt the ground under her tilt in a direction she had no idea how to correct. Whatever Daniel Reyes was hiding, whatever history connected him to the company that had built her entire identity, she understood with sudden, cold clarity that she had just spent 3 years running a company without knowing who actually owned it, and that the board's panic was not going to end with a simple apology. She turned back toward the tower, its windows catching the late afternoon light like a wall of watching eyes. And for the first time since she'd taken the corner office, she walked into her own building feeling like an outsider all over again. The conference room went silent the moment Vanessa stepped through the door, which was somehow worse than the shouting she'd braced herself for on the elevator ride up. Richard Ashford sat at the head of the table with his hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone pale, and around him, the rest of the board occupied their usual seats with the stiff posture of people trying very hard not to look at each other. Grant Whitfield was the only one who met her eyes directly, and he did it with a faint, unreadable smile that made the back of her neck prickle before he'd said a single word. She took her seat at the far end of the table, the one that was technically hers by title, but had never once in 3 years felt like it actually belonged to her, and waited for someone to tell her exactly how badly she had damaged herself. Richard was the one who finally spoke, sliding a folder across the table toward her with the flat, careful motion of a man handling something he didn't want to touch longer than necessary. He told her that the trust holding Daniel Reyes' shares had been established decades ago by Arthur Cole, the company's founder, and had lain dormant since a falling out that predated Vanessa's arrival by more than 15 years. He told her that the trust had been quietly reactivated 8 months earlier, under new legal counsel, giving Daniel full voting rights over a stake large enough to swing any contested decision at the next shareholder meeting, and that until this afternoon, only 3 people in the building had known that reactivation had even occurred. Vanessa opened the folder and stared at a name she barely recognized attached to a percentage that made her stomach drop, and she asked, in a voice steadier than she felt, why nobody had told her the moment it happened. Nobody answered right away, which told her more than any answer could have. It was Grant who finally spoke, his tone almost lazy, almost pleasant. The tone of a man who enjoyed watching someone else discover the floor wasn't where they thought it was. He said that the reactivation had gone through legal and compliance exactly as it should have. That perhaps if she had spent less time chasing headlines and more time reading the filings her own general counsel prepared for her every quarter, she might have noticed the change herself, instead of hearing about it after nearly costing the company its most significant shareholder. Vanessa felt the accusation land exactly where he intended it to. But she also caught something underneath it, a satisfaction in his voice that didn't match a man who was supposedly as blindsided as everyone else. She filed the observation away without acting on it, because there wasn't room in her head yet for two crises at once. Richard pressed on before the tension in the room could curdle any further, explaining that Arthur Cole had cut his son out of active involvement in the company after a bitter dispute over the direction of the business, a dispute the board had spent years quietly framing internally as a matter of Daniel simply walking away, uninterested in the family legacy. Vanessa asked why a man who apparently walked away by choice would leave a trust sitting dormant instead of liquidating it entirely, and this time it was one of the older board members. A soft-spoken woman named Eleanor Voss, who rarely spoke in these meetings at all, who answered. Eleanor said that from what she understood, the estrangement had never been as simple as the official story made it sound, and that whatever had actually happened between Arthur and his son, it clearly hadn't been resolved before Arthur's death, which was likely the reason the trust had been reactivated now instead of simply dissolved. The comment hung in the air a beat too long, and Vanessa noticed Grant's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Another small crack in a story that was already sounding less tidy than the version Richard had first given her. The meeting ended with an order rather than a suggestion. Richard telling her plainly that she needed to repair this relationship personally and immediately, because if Daniel Reyes walked into the next shareholder vote still angry about a tow truck, the board would be handing him every reason he needed to remove her, and possibly the entire executive team along with her. Vanessa left the conference room with the folder pressed against her chest like something that might combust, and by the time she reached her office, she had already decided there was no point waiting for a formal introduction that would only feel more calculated the longer she delayed it. She pulled Daniel's contact information from the compliance file, a residential address in a modest neighborhood 20 minutes from the tower, nothing like the address she would have expected from a man who apparently held enough leverage to end her career. And she told her assistant to clear her evening. She found the house just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the row of maple trees lining the quiet street. A small two-story home with a basketball hoop bolted crookedly over the garage and a scooter abandoned on its side in the front yard. It looked nothing like the world she operated in. No gates, no security cameras mounted discreetly along the roofline. Nothing that announced wealth or power in any way she recognized. And for a moment, she wondered if the address had been wrong, if there had been some clerical error buried in the compliance file. Then Daniel opened the door before she'd even reached the porch steps, drying his hands on a dish towel, his expression shifting from mild confusion to something guarded the instant he recognized her. He didn't invite her in. He stood in the doorway with the towel still in his hands, glancing briefly over his shoulder toward the sound of a cartoon playing somewhere inside, and asked her, without any real warmth in his voice, what exactly she thought she was doing showing up at his house. Vanessa told him the truth, that the board had explained who he was, that she understood now the position she had put both of them in without meaning to, and that she wanted to apologize properly, away from cameras and conference rooms, because it was the least she owed him after the day he'd had. Daniel studied her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the urge to fill the silence with something more polished, but she made herself stay quiet instead, because for once, she suspected that silence would serve her better than words. He finally stepped back and led her into the front hallway, though he made it clear with his posture that this wasn't an invitation to stay long. The house smelled like dinner cooking somewhere in the back. Macaroni and something simple, and from the living room she could hear Marcus's small voice narrating along with whatever he was watching, blissfully unaware of the conversation happening a few feet away. Daniel kept his voice low, telling her that he appreciated her coming in person, that it took a certain amount of nerve, but that an apology didn't erase what had happened, and that he needed her to understand something before this went any further. He told her that he hadn't touched anything related to coal dynamics in 15 years, that he built a life deliberately far away from boardrooms and shareholder meetings, and that the only reason the trust had been reactivated at all was because his father's death had triggered a clause neither of them had anticipated. Vanessa asked him carefully what exactly had happened between him and his father, and Daniel's expression closed like a door. He told her that wasn't the story he owed her. Not on the same day she'd had his truck towed, with his son locked inside it, and Vanessa feeling the sting of the rebuke, but recognizing the fairness of it. Didn't push. Instead, she asked him what he wanted, whether there was some concession, some formal apology, some public statement that would ease the tension between them enough to get through the next quarter without the company falling apart around both of them. Daniel's laugh was short and humorless, and he told her that she'd misunderstood him completely if she thought this was about extracting something from her, that he had spent years trying to avoid exactly this kind of entanglement, and that the last thing he wanted was to become some symbolic weight in her corporate power struggle. Vanessa felt something shift slightly in her chest at that. An unfamiliar sensation of being seen, not as a threat or a solution, but simply as a person making a mess of things. And she found herself telling him without quite deciding to, that she understood what it felt like to be underestimated by people who'd already decided who you were before you opened your mouth. Daniel's eyes flicked toward her with something like surprise, and for a moment, the guarded distance between them cracked just slightly enough for her to see the exhaustion underneath his anger. The particular tiredness of a man who had spent the whole afternoon managing his son's fear on top of his own. He told her more quietly this time that Marcus had asked him 3 times that evening if the bad lady was going to come back and take the truck again, and that he didn't have a good answer for him, because he genuinely didn't know what she was capable of yet. The comment landed harder than anything else he'd said, and Vanessa found herself, for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, wanting to prove him wrong about that specific thing more than she wanted to protect her position on the board. She told him she would speak with Marcus herself if he was comfortable with it, not with cameras, not with any kind of statement, just an honest apology from her to his son. So the boy could see for himself that the woman who'd frightened him wasn't some faceless villain who might reappear without warning. Daniel hesitated, clearly weighing the offer against his instinct to keep his son as far from this world as possible. But after a moment, he called Marcus in from the living room, kneeling down to explain in simple terms who Vanessa was and why she wanted to talk to him. Marcus approached warily, keeping close to his father's leg, and Vanessa crouched down to his eye level the way she had in the parking garage earlier that day, telling him plainly that she had made a mistake, a real one, and that she was sorry it had scared him so badly. She told him the truck was fine, that it hadn't been damaged, and that nobody was going to take it or him anywhere ever again because of anything she did. Marcus studied her with the unfiltered scrutiny only children seemed capable of, and after a long pause, he asked her if she was going to be mean to his dad now that she knew who he was. A question so direct it caught both adults off guard. Vanessa told him no, that she wasn't planning on being mean to anyone, and that she actually hoped she and his dad could figure out how to be less like strangers. which seemed to satisfy him enough that he wandered back toward the living room without further comment. Daniel walked her to the door afterward, his posture slightly less rigid than it had been when she'd arrived, though the wariness hadn't disappeared entirely. He told her he appreciated what she'd said to Marcus, that it mattered more than any statement she could have released to the press. But he also warned her that this didn't mean the two of them were suddenly fine, that there was a lot neither of them understood yet. About why his father's trust had come back to life the way it had, and that she should be careful trusting everyone currently telling her how sorry they were about the situation. Vanessa asked him what he meant by that, and Daniel glanced back toward the house, lowering his voice as though the walls themselves might be listening, and told her that Grant Whitfield had called him twice that afternoon before she'd even made it to his door, offering what he described as reassurance that Daniel wouldn't need to get personally involved in company matters at all if he simply signed something Grant would be happy to send over. The words settled into Vanessa with the cold weight of confirmation, the same instinct she'd felt in the conference room when Grant's satisfaction hadn't quite matched his supposed surprise. She thanked Daniel for telling her, and he shrugged, telling her he wasn't doing it as a favor to her specifically, only that he didn't like being maneuvered by people who assumed he was too disconnected from the business to notice when he was being handled. As she walked back to her car under the darkening sky, Vanessa found herself replaying the entire day, the boardroom, the quiet house with its crooked basketball hoop, and Grant's 2 phone calls placed before she'd even had the chance to apologize. And she understood with a clarity that unsettled her more than the original crisis had, that whatever was happening inside Coal Dynamics was far larger and far older than one impulsive decision about a poorly parked truck. The following week settled into a rhythm neither Vanessa nor Daniel had planned for, though both of them recognized almost immediately that avoiding each other entirely was no longer an option. Marcus's school, it turned out, sat only 4 blocks from the Coal Dynamics tower, a coincidence Daniel hadn't fully appreciated until his usual after-school babysitter fell through, and he found himself walking his son to the lobby cafe some afternoons simply because it was the only place nearby with decent Wi-Fi and a chair where Marcus could do his homework while Daniel finished a freelance carpentry bid on his laptop. Vanessa noticed them there on a Tuesday afternoon, tucked into a corner table near the window, and instead of retreating to her office as she normally would have, she found herself walking over, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. Some combination of guilt and curiosity she hadn't fully examined yet. Daniel looked up warily when her shadow fell across the table, the same instinctive tension he seemed to carry every time she entered a room. But Marcus greeted her with an ease that surprised them both, holding up a half-finished worksheet on fractions and asking her without any hesitation if she knew how to do the one he was stuck on. Vanessa slid into the chair across from him before Daniel could object, walking Marcus through the problem with a patience that felt unfamiliar even to her, breaking the fraction down into pizza slices, because that was the only trick she remembered from her own childhood tutor. And when she glanced up afterward, she caught Daniel watching her with an expression that wasn't quite trust yet, but wasn't the guarded hostility of the week before either. He admitted almost reluctantly that Marcus hadn't stopped talking about her since the night at their house, cycling through questions about whether she lived in the big glass building and whether she was actually in charge of it, whether she had her own elevator, whether she'd ever met a real astronaut given how tall the building was. Vanessa found the admission oddly touching, a small proof that at least one member of that household didn't automatically assume the worst of her. And she told Daniel, half joking, that she was beginning to prefer Marcus's opinion of her to the one currently circulating 3 floors below her office. Their conversations over the following days remained careful, professional on the surface, but something in the dynamic between them shifted incrementally each time they crossed paths. Daniel began arriving earlier some afternoons, ostensibly because the lobby cafe had better lighting for his sketches of a custom bookshelf he was quoting, and Vanessa began finding reasons to leave her office at the same hour, telling herself it was simply convenient timing for her evening calls, though neither of them acknowledged the pattern out loud. She learned in fragments, dropped between homework help and small talk, that he'd spent the last decade doing skilled trade work, custom cabinetry mostly, building a modest but steady business from nothing after leaving whatever life he'd once had connected to his father's world. He described the satisfaction of working with his hands, of seeing a finished piece of furniture leave his shop, and knowing exactly how every joint and seam had been made a kind of tangible certainty he said he'd never found in anything resembling corporate life. He never elaborated on what exactly had driven that departure, and she never pushed, sensing that the wound underneath it was still raw enough that direct questions would only close him off again. Instead, she watched him in the small, unguarded moments, the way he explained long division to Marcus without a trace of impatience, sketching little diagrams on a napkin until the numbers made sense. The way his shoulders dropped a fraction whenever his son laughed at something, and she found herself recalibrating everything she'd assumed about him in that first frantic minute outside the tower. One afternoon, waiting for Marcus to finish a reading assignment, Daniel asked her almost carefully what it had been like growing up in the Cole family. Whether the version of her childhood the business magazines liked to print, the prodigy adopted into wealth and groomed for leadership, bore any resemblance to the truth. Vanessa hesitated before answering honestly, telling him that the magazines left out the years before the adoption was finalized, when she'd been old enough to understand she was being evaluated as much as loved. Old enough to feel the weight of every dinner where someone's cousin or uncle made a pointed comment about blood and legacy within earshot. She told him she'd learned early that hesitation read as weakness in that house, that speed and certainty were the only currencies that earned her a permanent seat at the table, and that she'd spent every year since proving she deserved to be there before anyone could suggest otherwise. Daniel listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he told her quietly that it explained a great deal about the woman who'd pointed at his truck without checking who was inside it. It wasn't cruel, the way he said it. It sounded almost like sympathy, and Vanessa found she didn't mind it landing that way. The professional crisis, meanwhile, hadn't disappeared simply because the personal tension between them had eased. A supply chain failure hit one of Cole Dynamics' largest manufacturing partners that Thursday, threatening to delay the rollout of the very product Vanessa had launched the week before. And the timing could not have been worse, given how closely the board was already watching her every decision. She spent the morning in back-to-back calls with logistics teams and legal counsel, trying to piece together an alternative supplier fast enough to avoid a public delay announcement, snapping at her assistant twice before catching herself and apologizing, aware that the old reflex to solve everything through sheer force of will was no longer serving her the way it once had. It was during the worst of that chaos that she discovered, almost by accident, scrolling through an old vendor list Daniel had mentioned in passing, that his small business had a long-standing relationship with exactly the kind of specialized fabrication shop she needed, a connection built through years of trade work rather than corporate networking, the kind of resource that never showed up in any database her procurement team had access to. She hesitated before asking him for help, aware of how it might look. The CEO who had humiliated him in public, now showing up to ask for a professional favor. Running through a dozen ways to phrase the request that wouldn't sound like she was simply using him again. The situation had grown urgent enough, though, that pride felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. And she found him in the lobby cafe that evening, Marcus absorbed in a coloring book. Beside him, and laid out the problem plainly, without softening it or dressing it up as anything other than what it was. Daniel listened, tapping a pencil against his sketchbook, and to her surprise, he didn't hesitate before offering to make a call to an old contact who ran a smaller fabrication operation 2 states over, a shop capable of handling the overflow on short notice if the terms were fair to the workers involved, which he made clear mattered more to him than the speed of the favor itself. Vanessa thanked him, more sincerely than she expected to, and Daniel shrugged it off, telling her he wasn't doing it for her specifically, only that a factory full of workers losing shifts over a corporate scheduling failure wasn't something he could ignore if he had the ability to help, which told her more about the kind of man he was than anything he could have said directly about himself. The contact came through by Friday morning, salvaging the production timeline just enough to avoid a public announcement, and Vanessa found herself genuinely grateful in a way that had nothing to do with strategy or optics. She invited Daniel up to the executive floor that afternoon, ostensibly to formalize the vendor arrangement with her legal team, though she suspected some part of her simply wanted an excuse to see how he handled the space that had built the wall between them in the first place. He arrived looking distinctly uncomfortable, glancing around the glass-walled offices with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between old familiarity and deliberate resistance, as though the building itself contained memories he'd spent years trying to outrun, his hand tightening briefly on the strap of his bag as the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor. It was during that visit that Vanessa first noticed how the staff on the executive floor reacted to him, not with the polite indifference reserved for an outside vendor, but with a strange, careful deference that seemed to predate any formal introduction. An older security guard near the elevator bank nodded at Daniel with unmistakable recognition, calling him by name before anyone had said it aloud, asking after his health with a familiarity that startled them both. One of the longtime executive assistants, a woman who had worked at Coal Dynamics longer than Vanessa had been alive, actually paused mid-stride in the hallway, staring at Daniel with an expression somewhere between shock and something like grief, her hand rising halfway to her mouth before she quickly composed herself and hurried on without a word. Vanessa filed both moments away, another piece of the pattern that told her the official story of Daniel's estrangement from the company was missing something significant, something the older employees clearly remembered, even if the current board preferred it stay buried. She asked him about it once they were alone in the small conference room reserved for vendor meetings, and Daniel's jaw tightened in the same way it had the night at his house when she'd asked about his father. He told her that some of the people on this floor had known him since he was a teenager, back when he used to spend summers in this building learning the business from his father before everything fell apart, sitting in on meetings he barely understood, eating lunch in the executive dining room, while his father introduced him to partners twice his age. He said seeing their reactions now was harder than he'd expected it to be, like walking through a museum built entirely out of a life he'd deliberately buried. Vanessa asked gently this time what exactly had fallen apart, and for a moment she thought he might actually answer, his guard slipping just enough to reveal something raw underneath his eyes, drifting toward the window instead of her, before he caught himself and told her it wasn't a story that belonged in a conference room over vendor paperwork. She let it go again, though the restraint cost her more than she expected, some new and unfamiliar instinct in her wanting to understand him fully rather than simply manage the professional risk he represented. Their meeting wrapped up efficiently enough, the vendor terms finalized, the immediate crisis resolved, but as Daniel gathered his things to leave, Grant Whitfield appeared in the doorway, with the kind of casual timing that Vanessa was beginning to recognize as never actually casual at all. Grant greeted Daniel with an overly familiar warmth that didn't match the tension in his posture, calling him by a nickname Vanessa had never heard anyone use, something from what sounded like a much younger, much less guarded version of the man standing across from her now. Daniel's entire demeanor shifted instantly, the openness he'd shown moments before, replaced by a controlled wariness that told her exactly how much history existed between these two men, his shoulders squaring the same way they had outside the truck the day it was towed. Grant made small talk for exactly as long as politeness required, before steering the conversation toward what Vanessa now recognized as his actual purpose. Mentioning offhandedly that the paperwork he'd sent over regarding the trust was still awaiting Daniel's signature, and that it would really simplify things for everyone if Daniel could get to it soon, given how busy the upcoming shareholder season was shaping up to be. Daniel's response was clipped, telling Grant he'd get to it on his own schedule. And Grant's smile thinned slightly before he excused himself, glancing once at Vanessa with an expression she couldn't quite decode before disappearing back down the hallway. It left behind a silence that felt considerably heavier than before he'd arrived. Vanessa asked Daniel directly what paperwork Grant was referring to, and this time he didn't deflect entirely, telling her it was some kind of voting proxy agreement that would effectively hand his shares' influence over to a committee Grant controlled, framed as a convenience so Daniel wouldn't have to personally attend board matters he had no interest in. The revelation landed with the force of confirmation rather than surprise, slotting neatly into the pattern Vanessa had been assembling since the night at Daniel's house. Grant's 2 phone calls before she'd even apologized, his strange satisfaction in the board meeting, and now this attempt to consolidate voting power under the guise of sparing Daniel the hassle. She told him plainly that she didn't think he should sign anything without independent legal counsel reviewing it first, someone with no connection to Grant or the existing board structure. And Daniel studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing whether her advice was genuine concern or simply another attempt to manipulate his shares in a different direction. She understood the suspicion had earned every bit of it, but something in her tone must have convinced him of her sincerity, because he told her he'd already been leaning that way himself, and that her confirmation only strengthened his resolve to slow down and figure out exactly what Grant was trying to accomplish before he signed away any influence at all. As he left that evening, Marcus's small hand tucked into his, Vanessa stood at her office window watching them cross the plaza toward the same spot where the tow truck had once hauled away everything Marcus trusted about the world being safe, and she felt something settle in her chest that she couldn't fully name yet. Some blend of protectiveness and unease that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or shareholder votes. She pulled up the compliance file again that night, reading through the trust documentation more carefully than she had the first time, searching for the exact date Arthur Cole had established it and the precise wording of the clause that had triggered its reactivation upon his death. Buried in a footnote she'd skimmed past before, she found a reference to a prior amendment filed years earlier, one that had apparently been quietly reversed under Grant's oversight not long after Arthur's passing. And as she stared at the legal language, cross-referencing dates against Daniel's account of his estrangement, she began to suspect that whatever had actually driven father and son apart all those years ago had very little to do with the story the board had told her, and everything to do with the man who had just walked out of her office, pretending to be nothing more than a helpful bystander. The morning of the shareholder meeting arrived with a kind of tension Vanessa had never felt walking into that building before. Not on her first day as CEO, not during the hostile takeover attempt 2 years earlier, not even during the tow truck fiasco that had started all of this. She had spent the better part of the weekend cross-referencing the footnote she'd found in the trust documentation, pulling old board minutes from the archive with the help of a paralegal she trusted enough to keep quiet, and piecing together a picture that made her stomach turn every time she looked at it directly. The amendment Grant had quietly reversed wasn't a minor technical correction. It had originally protected Daniel's voting rights from being bundled into any proxy committee without his explicit, individually witnessed consent, a protection Arthur Cole had apparently insisted on years before his death, and one that had vanished from the official record less than 6 months after he passed away. Right around the same time, Grant had begun circulating the very proxy agreement he was now pressuring Daniel to sign. She had tried calling Daniel twice over the weekend to share what she'd found, but both calls had gone unanswered, and by Sunday night, she understood why. when she saw the missed call log on her own phone. Reversed 3 attempts from his number in the early afternoon that she'd missed while stuck in a call with legal. When she finally reached him that evening, his voice carried an edge she hadn't heard from him before, tight and controlled, in the way of someone holding back something significant. He told her that a courier had shown up at his house that morning with a revised version of the proxy agreement, one that no longer politely requested his signature, but instead cited a clause claiming that failure to respond within 5 business days would be interpreted as passive consent under the original trust language. A legal maneuver that sounded, even to Vanessa's non-lawyer ears, exactly like the kind of language someone slipped into a document, hoping nobody would read it carefully enough to object. She told him what she'd found in the archived minutes, the vanished protection clause, the timeline that placed its removal squarely in the months following his father's death. And there was a long silence on the line before Daniel said quietly that he needed her to tell him everything she knew, because he was done being handled by people who assumed his absence from the business meant his indifference to it. It was the first time he had asked her for something, rather than simply tolerating her presence. And Vanessa felt the shift in their dynamic settle into something sturdier, something that resembled an actual alliance rather than a fragile truce built on guilt and apology. They met the next morning in her office before the shareholder meeting, going through the documents together at her desk. Daniel reading with the same careful attention he brought to a piece of furniture he was building, checking every joint for weakness before trusting it to hold weight. It was during that review that he told her, finally, the story he'd refused to share in the conference room and in his own living room, the one piece missing from everything she'd assembled on her own. He told her that his father had discovered in the final year of his life that Grant had been quietly diverting a portion of the company's overseas manufacturing contract to a shell entity that funneled profits back to Grant personally. A scheme small enough to escape casual audit, but large enough, compounded over years, to represent millions in undisclosed self-dealing. Arthur had confronted Grant privately, intending to bring the matter to the full board, but before he could do so, he suffered the stroke that would eventually take his life, leaving the accusation unresolved and undocumented anywhere except in a private journal Daniel had found among his father's belongings after the funeral. Daniel told her that when he'd raised the journal's contents with the board, at the time grieving and uncertain of himself, Grant had been the one to gently suggest in front of everyone that perhaps a devastated son processing his father's sudden decline had misread, confused medication-affected writings as something more sinister than they actually were. The board, eager to move past the tension and protect the company's public image during a delicate leadership transition, had accepted that explanation with visible relief. And Daniel, exhausted and unable to prove anything definitive, had withdrawn from the company entirely, rather than watch his father's final concerns get quietly buried by the very people his father had trusted. He'd taken his young son and built a life as far from boardrooms as he could manage, believing the trust would simply dissolve into irrelevance over time, never imagining it would be reactivated in a way that pulled him directly back into the mess he'd spent years trying to escape. Vanessa listened to all of it with a growing cold clarity, understanding now why Grant's reaction to the tow truck incident had never quite matched genuine surprise, why his 2 phone calls to Daniel had come so quickly, why he'd been so eager to secure Daniel's voting rights under a proxy agreement before anyone examined the timeline too closely. She told Daniel with the particular kind of honesty that came only from genuine urgency that she believed him completely, and that she intended to bring everything they'd found to the shareholder meeting that afternoon, rather than allow Grant another quiet quarter to consolidate control. Daniel studied her for a long moment, the same assessing look he'd given her outside the tow truck nearly 2 weeks earlier, though this time it carried none of the contempt from that first day, only a cautious, hard-won trust that she understood she would need to keep earning for a long time. The shareholder meeting convened at 2 o'clock in the largest conference room on the top floor. The long table filled with faces Vanessa had spent 3 years learning to read. Some allies, some skeptics, and at least one man she now understood to be an active threat. Sitting calmly near the head of the table, as though nothing at all was wrong. Grant opened the meeting with his usual polished ease, moving through the quarterly agenda items with practiced confidence, and Vanessa let him proceed through the first several items without interruption, waiting for the moment when the floor would open for new business. Watching Daniel take his seat at the far end of the table for the first time in over a decade, his presence alone sending a visible ripple of unease through several long-time board members who clearly remembered exactly who he was. When the floor finally opened, Vanessa stood, and she felt every eye in the room shift toward her with the particular weight of an audience that already suspected something significant was about to happen. She began carefully laying out the timeline of the trust's reactivation, the mysterious removal of the consent protection clause following Arthur Cole's death, and the aggressive new proxy language now threatening to strip Daniel of independent control over his own shares. Grant's expression remained composed at first, offering the same dismissive explanation he'd given years earlier, framing the situation as routine legal housekeeping being misinterpreted by people unfamiliar with trust law. But Vanessa didn't stop there. She introduced the archived board minutes, the exact date the protection clause vanished, cross-referenced against internal transfer records she'd pulled over the weekend, showing payments routed through a shell entity registered under an address that traced after some digging her paralegal had done quietly through public filings back to a property owned by Grant's brother-in-law. The room went very still. Eleanor Voss, who had spoken so little in every meeting Vanessa had witnessed, leaned forward with an expression of dawning, furious recognition, telling the room quietly that she remembered Arthur mentioning concerns about certain manufacturing contracts in the months before his stroke. Concerns she'd assumed at the time were simply the confusion of a man in declining health, exactly as Grant had suggested. Grant's composure finally cracked at that, his voice rising as he accused Vanessa of orchestrating a smear campaign to distract from her own catastrophic public relations disaster, with the tow truck framing the entire presentation as a desperate attempt to save her own position by manufacturing a scandal against him. It was, Vanessa realized, a reasonably effective deflection under different circumstances, one that might have worked if she hadn't anticipated exactly this response and prepared for it. She turned to Daniel, who rose from his seat with the same quiet composure he'd shown throughout their growing partnership. And he addressed the board directly for the first time in over a decade, his voice steady despite the tension visibly running through him. He told them about his father's journal, about the private confrontation Arthur had described in his own handwriting before his stroke, about the years he had spent watching that unresolved accusation eat away at his trust in the very company his father had built. He told them that he had no personal interest in reclaiming a seat at this table, that he had built a life he was proud of far from all of this, but that he refused to let his father's final concerns be buried a second time simply because it was convenient for the people currently running the company. His voice cracked only once when he mentioned his son, explaining that he wanted Marcus to grow up believing that the truth eventually mattered, even in rooms full of powerful people who preferred it stay hidden. Grant attempted one final counterattack, questioning the authenticity of the journal, suggesting it had likely been altered or misremembered in the years since Arthur's death. But Vanessa produced the final piece of evidence she'd been holding back, an email exchange her paralegal had uncovered in an old server backup. One Grant had apparently forgotten still existed, showing direct correspondence between Grant and the shell entity's registered agent discussing contract routing terms dated 8 months before Arthur's death, well before any illness could account for confusion or misinterpretation. The room erupted into overlapping voices, board members demanding explanations, Grant's own allies suddenly distancing themselves from him with visible urgency. And in the chaos, Vanessa caught Daniel's eye across the table, finding in his expression something that looked for the first time since they'd met, like genuine gratitude, rather than wary tolerance. Richard Ashford finally restored order. His voice, carrying the particular authority of a man who understood exactly how serious this had just become, calling for an immediate independent investigation into Grant's financial dealings and a formal suspension of his voting privileges pending its outcome. Grant left the room without another word, his face a mask of controlled fury that told Vanessa this fight was far from over, even if today's battle had gone decisively against him. As the meeting adjourned in a haze of urgent whispered conversations and hurried phone calls to legal counsel, Vanessa found herself standing near the window with Daniel, both of them momentarily set apart from the chaos they'd just unleashed, and he told her quietly that he hadn't expected walking into that room to end the day feeling like he'd finally honored something he owed his father. Vanessa admitted that she hadn't expected 2 weeks earlier to end up fighting alongside the very man she'd humiliated in front of a dozen cameras. And something passed between them in that admission that felt less like relief and more like the fragile, uncertain beginning of something neither of them was quite ready to name yet. But even as the immediate crisis resolved itself, Vanessa understood that the cost of today's victory wasn't finished being tallied. Her own signature, she realized with a sinking feeling as she reviewed the old transfer approvals later that evening, appeared on at least one routine budget authorization from years earlier that had buried within its line items approved funding for a logistics contract connected to Grant's shell arrangement, a document she had signed in her early months as CEO, without the scrutiny she now understood she should have applied. It wasn't intentional complicity, but it wouldn't matter to the investors who would eventually ask hard questions about how thoroughly she had vetted the company's finances during her tenure. And she knew that whatever trust she had rebuilt with Daniel today would soon be tested again by a very different kind of reckoning, one where her own competence, not just her judgment about towed trucks, would be laid bare for everyone to examine. The investigation into Grant Whitfield's dealings moved faster than anyone at Coal Dynamics had anticipated, propelled by the kind of urgency that came only when a company's own board members feared for their personal liability. Within 72 hours, outside forensic accountants had confirmed what Vanessa already suspected from the email trail she'd uncovered, tracing nearly $4 million in diverted contract value routed through the shell entity over the better part of a decade, funds that had quietly padded Grant's personal accounts, while the company absorbed inflated manufacturing costs it never fully understood. Richard Ashford called an emergency session the following week to formally remove Grant from the board, a vote that passed unanimously, including from 2 members who had been Grant's closest allies only days before their sudden conversion, less a matter of principle than pure self-preservation. Once the numbers became undeniable, Vanessa watched the vote from her seat at the head of the table, feeling none of the triumph she might have expected from finally dismantling the man who had spent 3 years quietly undermining her. Only a tired, hollow relief that the immediate threat was gone, even as she understood a larger reckoning was still waiting for her. That reckoning arrived the following Monday, in the form of her own budget authorization from 4 years earlier, the document she had signed during her second month as CEO, back when she was still learning which line items deserved careful scrutiny and which were routine enough to trust to her finance team's recommendation. The forensic accountants flagged it during their broader review, noting that the logistics contract buried within its approvals had funneled a portion of its funding directly into Grant's shell arrangement. And while nobody seriously suggested Vanessa had known what she was authorizing, the fact remained that her signature sat on a document that had enabled years of fraud she should have caught. Richard called her into his office privately to deliver the news himself, rather than letting her hear it secondhand, telling her gently but plainly that some faction of the board, emboldened by Grant's fall and eager to demonstrate accountability to nervous investors, was already whispering about whether her oversight failures during those early years disqualified her from continuing as chief executive. Vanessa left that meeting feeling the particular vertigo of watching a victory curdle into something far more precarious. Understanding that the very investigation she had launched to protect Daniel and expose Grant's corruption had now turned its scrutiny back onto her own record. She spent that evening at her apartment, reviewing every document from her first 2 years as CEO with a thoroughness she hadn't applied even during her original confirmation hearings, searching for anything else buried in the fine print that might resurface in the coming weeks. And it was during that long, exhausting night that she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything the past 2 weeks had cost her. Not just professionally, but in the quiet, private accounting of who she had believed herself to be before a tow truck and a screaming child had cracked that identity open. Daniel arrived unannounced around 9 that evening. Marcus asleep in the back seat of his car after a long day, explaining, when she opened the door, that he'd heard through the grapevine at the building from the same longtime employees who had once startled at the sight of him in the hallway, that the board was circling her position now that Grant was gone. He told her he hadn't liked the idea of her sitting alone with that news, and Vanessa, who had spent her entire adult life keeping people at exactly the distance required to never need this kind of gesture, found herself unexpectedly undone by the simple fact of him showing up. She invited him in, careful not to wake Marcus, still buckled in the car, and they sat together at her kitchen island while she walked him through what she'd found in her own old records. The budget authorization that had never registered as a red flag until a forensic team went looking for exactly that kind of blind spot. Daniel listened without the polished reassurance she might have expected from someone trying to comfort her, and instead told her something that landed harder than any comfort could have. He said that he understood better than almost anyone what it felt like to have your own signature used as evidence of complicity in something you never intended, that he had spent years believing his silence after his father's death made him partially responsible for whatever damage followed, even though he'd had no real power to stop it at the time. He told her that the difference between them and people like Grant wasn't the absence of mistakes. It was what they chose to do once the mistakes came to light, and that everything she had done in the past 2 weeks, confronting the board, uncovering the fraud, refusing to let his father's concerns stay buried, told him more about her character than one careless signature from 4 years ago ever could. Vanessa felt something in her chest loosen at hearing it. Some old defensive posture she'd carried since childhood finally allowed to rest for the length of that conversation. The formal board hearing convened 3 days later, a smaller and far more subdued affair than the explosive shareholder meeting that had exposed Grant. Conducted instead in a closed session, limited to directors and legal counsel. Vanessa arrived prepared not to defend herself with the practiced confidence she usually brought into rooms like this, but with something closer to honest accountability, laying out exactly what she had missed in her early oversight, what systems she had since strengthened to prevent similar blind spots, and what she believed the company needed going forward to ensure no single executive signature could authorize contracts of that scale without deeper cross-verification. She didn't minimize her failure, and she didn't perform contrition either, simply presenting the facts with the same clear-eyed directness she had used to dismantle Grant's defense the week before, trusting that the board could distinguish between negligence and complicity if she gave them the full picture rather than a curated one. Eleanor Voss was the one who spoke first, once Vanessa finished telling the room quietly that she had served on this board for nearly 20 years and had watched more than one executive attempt to obscure their mistakes rather than own them the way Vanessa just had, and that in her experience, the willingness to name a failure honestly mattered more for a company's long-term health than the failure itself. Several other board members echoed the sentiment, and Richard, who had clearly been quietly building support before the hearing even began, moved to formally close the matter with a unanimous vote of confidence in Vanessa's continued leadership, contingent on the new financial oversight protocols she had already begun drafting. The vote passed, and Vanessa felt the tension she'd been carrying for days finally begin to release. Though she understood the relief came not from having escaped consequences entirely, but from having faced them honestly enough to survive them intact. In the weeks that followed, the company settled into a new rhythm, under leadership that finally felt to Vanessa like something she had actually earned rather than simply defended. Daniel's trust remained intact, though he made it clear during a quiet conversation over coffee that he had no interest in taking an active board seat himself, preferring instead to appoint an independent proxy, someone with no personal stake in the company's internal politics, to vote his shares in alignment with whatever recommendations that proxy believed served the company's long-term health rather than any particular executive's convenience. It was Vanessa realized a solution that protected both his family's privacy and the company's stability, and she found herself relieved rather than threatened by the arrangement, understanding that whatever was growing between them didn't need to be complicated by the very corporate entanglements that had first thrown them into each other's orbit under such disastrous circumstances. Their relationship, freed from the immediate pressure of crisis, developed slowly over the following months in ways that surprised them both. Vanessa found herself at Daniel's workshop on weekends, initially under the pretense of discussing vendor logistics for the fabrication partnership that had proven so valuable during the supply chain crisis, though the meetings gradually stretched longer than any business conversation required, filled instead with easy conversation about nothing in particular, while Marcus narrated his own elaborate imaginary worlds nearby. Daniel taught her with visible amusement at her initial clumsiness how to sand a piece of raw wood properly, how to feel for the grain instead of forcing the tool against it, and she found in the slow, deliberate patience the work required a counterbalance to the relentless speed she had spent her whole career cultivating. He told her once, watching her focus intently on a small cutting board she was determined to finish herself, that this was the first time he'd seen her move through anything without trying to win it. And she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty that she was beginning to understand there were parts of life that speed and control simply couldn't touch. Marcus, for his part, had long since stopped associating Vanessa with fear, treating her instead with the casual, unguarded affection children extended to adults they decided belonged in their orbit, once informing her with great seriousness that she was now allowed to come to his school's science fair because she was, in his words, basically part of the family, even if she didn't live at the house yet. Daniel had laughed at that, embarrassed and pleased in equal measure, and Vanessa had felt something in her chest ache with a tenderness she hadn't expected to feel this early, this completely, for a child who wasn't hers, and a life she hadn't imagined for herself only 2 months earlier. She attended the science fair, standing beside Daniel in a gymnasium that smelled like poster paint and nervous energy, watching Marcus present his volcano model with the same fierce concentration his father brought to a piece of furniture. And she understood in that ordinary, unremarkable moment that this was the life she actually wanted, not the corner office view she had spent 3 years defending at all costs. The company itself emerged from the scandal stronger than it had entered it. The new oversight protocols earning cautious praise from investors who had feared in the immediate aftermath of Grant's exposure that Cold Dynamics might be facing the kind of prolonged instability that destroyed shareholder confidence for years. Vanessa used the crisis as an opportunity to rebuild not just financial safeguards, but the broader culture of the executive floor, insisting on more transparent communication between departments and instituting a policy that no major operational decision, including something as small as a parking enforcement order, could be executed without basic verification of the circumstances involved, a rule the board approved with visible wry amusement. given exactly how the entire crisis had begun. She found, in the months that followed, that her decisiveness hadn't disappeared, only sharpened by a new instinct to pair speed with genuine attention. Understanding at last that the two qualities weren't in opposition the way she'd always assumed. Grant's legal troubles continued to unfold slowly through the following year, the forensic evidence proving thorough enough that prosecutors eventually filed formal fraud charges. Though Vanessa found she had little emotional investment left in tracking every detail of his downfall once the company's immediate stability was secured. What mattered more to her was watching Daniel gradually reclaim pieces of his relationship with the company his father had built, not through any formal return to its leadership, but through smaller gestures, agreeing finally to have a portion of Arthur's old office preserved as a small archive, honoring the company's founding history, a project he oversaw personally, with the same careful attention he brought to his cabinetry work. Restoring old photographs and letters that had sat forgotten in storage for over a decade. Vanessa attended the small, quiet unveiling of that archive alongside him, watching him run his hand along the edge of his father's old desk with an expression of hard-won peace. And she understood that whatever justice this story had ultimately delivered, it hadn't come from punishing Grant alone, but from Daniel finally allowing himself to grieve his father honestly in a space that no longer felt haunted by unresolved betrayal. On a quiet evening, nearly a year after the tow truck had first upended both their lives, Daniel invited Vanessa to the same parking structure where they'd first truly spoken as equals. The paramedics and panic long since replaced by ordinary evening traffic and the soft glow of streetlights. He told her, with the same careful directness she'd come to recognize as fundamental to who he was, that he had spent years after his father's death believing he'd permanently lost any chance at trusting the world connected to that building again, and that meeting her, however disastrously it began, had somehow given him back a version of that trust he'd thought was gone for good. Vanessa, standing in the same spot where she had once knelt to apologize to a frightened 7-year-old, told him that she had spent her entire life believing speed and control were the only things that made her valuable to anyone, and that he and Marcus had taught her slowly, and without either of them intending to, that the things worth keeping in life were rarely the ones you could rush toward. He asked her then, with none of the theatrical grandeur she might have once expected from the kind of story her life had accidentally become, whether she would consider building something slower and steadier with him, not a merger or an arrangement dictated by shares or trusts, but simply a life imperfect and ordinary in all the ways that mattered. One where Marcus could keep asking her ridiculous questions about elevators and astronauts for as long as he wanted to. Vanessa, who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of never letting anyone see her hesitate, let herself hesitate now. Not out of uncertainty, but out of the simple desire to hold the moment a little longer before answering. And when she finally said yes, it came out steadier and more certain than any decision she had made in that glass tower behind them. They stood together in the quiet lot as the sky darkened fully overhead. Two people who had begun as an accident of arrogance and misunderstanding, now standing on the other side of everything that mistake had cost, and given them both, finally certain that whatever came next, they would face it without either of them having to fight for it alone.